Good afternoon. I'm Steve Gibson, CEO of the Lupus Foundation of America, and I'd like to welcome you to the patient session, Clinical Trials and New Treatments for Lupus, led by Dr. Wallace and Dr. Merrill. The LFA, Lupus Foundation of America, is a proud sponsor of this session. We hope you had the opportunity to attend our patient lunch today and hear the great work that the Lupus Foundation of America is doing in research, advocacy, and education. We are here to provide services and support, as well as help develop an arsenal of treatments for everyone with lupus. We also would like to acknowledge the many international groups that are attending Lupus 2019. Can I see a show of hands of how many people are here from international organizations? Great. Wonderful. Well, welcome. Before we start the session, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Wallace, Dr. Merrill for their leadership, not only in the field, but leadership for the Lupus Foundation of America. Dr. Merrill is currently the Chief Advisor for Clinical Development for the Lupus Foundation of America, former medical director, thank you, and Dr. Wallace is serving as a subject matter expert on the development of a lupus self-management program and former chair of the board for the Lupus Foundation of America. Thank you both for your dedication to this field. Now I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Wallace, who has a very exciting presentation for us all. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes talking about where we are currently in the field of lupus treatments and why it's not good enough. And then Dr. Merrill is going to present the initiatives that are ongoing to improve it. And then we have a very exciting speaker, Dr. Burris, who is going to wrap this all up in a very tiny package with where we should be going from here. So let's talk about what has happened in the last 5 years in specific areas of lupus management that you're all familiar with. We'll talk about what's new with non-steroidals, antimalarials, corticosteroids, topical therapies, immune suppressive regimens, biologic therapies, and conclude with the need for new drugs in lupus. Most of us don't realize that there have been some incremental advances in the last 5 years. For example, approximately 80% of all patients with SLE are taking over-the-counter or prescription non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs such as ibuprofen or Advil or Aleve. And they do so for low-grade fevers, headaches, arthralgias, muscle aches, pleurisy or chest pains, and 80% use it intermittently, 20% daily. But the problem is that none of these agents are DMARDs. They're not disease-modifying. And their use is limited by kidney, liver, and GI toxicity. So what's new in the last 5 years? What's new are that now we can have some of these available as a schmear or topically. And the main one that's used in the United States and internationally is diclofenac or Voltaren gel, and there's also compounded ketoprofen gel. The reason why I mention this is that they're applied every 6 hours. They are extremely non-toxic because no more than 6% gets systemically absorbed. And in fact, in the last 5 years since it became approved by the FDA, topical nonsteroidals are the first line of choice for rheumatologists and orthopedists in managing hand osteoarthritis. In the 2018 EULAR, or European Recommendations for the Management of Hand Arthritis, it says topical treatments are preferred over systemic treatments because of safety reasons. Topical NSAIDs are the first pharmacologic topical treatment of choice. And a significant minority of lupus patients have osteoarthritis, and many of them have relief from their inflammation when they use these agents. You have to use them like every 6 hours sometimes. Just using it occasionally may not be enough. But there are no reports of lupus patients having adverse reactions to topical NSAIDs. Let's move on to antimalarials. How many patients here are taking antimalarials? How many lupus patients in this audience are not taking antimalarials? Only a handful. These are very, very useful drugs. We've heard several presentations and posters on this at this meeting. But what's happened in the last 5 years? What's happened is that we can now measure drug levels, and we can tell if the patient is compliant or adherent with taking the drug. Because if you don't take the drug, it won't work. And patients who are inconsistent with taking the drug have more damage and more flare rates. And this has been documented very, very recently. Why should lupus patients of all types, organ-threatening and non-organ-threatening, take or be started on antimalarials? It's because it reduces flares, organ damage, lowers lipid levels, reduces risk of clotting, and it makes some drugs, such as mycophenolate, more effective, and it improves survival. And now we have newer tools to pick up eye damage very early. The OCT, or optical coherence tomography, or multifocal electroretinograms, which can be done in an office setting by your ophthalmologist, can pick up early retinopathy, which was not possible 5 years ago. Although it is, there have been some debate, the American Academy of Ophthalmologic Surgery recently came out in the last 5 years with recommendations on screening for hydroxychloroquine or plaquenil retinopathy. And that's because if you are on the drug in a recommended dose, which is 5 mg per kilogram real weight, the risk of toxicity is less than 1%. At 10 years, it's still less than 2%. But by the time 20 years have elapsed, it goes up to almost 20%. Patients should have a baseline fundus exam to rule out anything pre-existing and be screened after at least 5 years, and their acceptable doses monitored with the OCT or other visual fields. Because you only have one set of eyes, it's not reversible, and it's really important that we track how much one is taking. What is new in cutaneous lupus? Well, cutaneous lupus can scar and lead to permanent hair loss and disfigurement. And so we do have some new treatments for this. One is there are some newer ultra-high potency and low potency topical steroids that have come on the market. Secondly, there are non-steroid anti-inflammatory topicals such as tacrolimus or Elidel, which have now become generic, so the prices become more accessible. Tacrolimus or penecrolimus is Protopic or Elidel, and they don't scar, they don't they don't thin out the skin to the extent that some of the fluorinated topical steroids do. We're using very small 27-gauge needles to inject steroids directly into cutaneous lesions. And antimalarials have been used historically in combination to treat this, as well as immune suppressives. But what's new? What's new are the novel agents. There are two approaches which are novel. One is there's a drug called tofacitinib, which is what we call a JAK inhibitor, which is on the market already for rheumatoid arthritis. It's also approved for psoriasis, Crohn's disease, and some dermatologists are using it for alopecia, mucocutaneous ulcerations. It's also approved for Crohn's disease. However, there is nothing to stop, and it's perfectly legal, to get tofacitinib produced by a compounding pharmacist as an ointment. And this is now the study of 5 controlled trials for use in hair loss and regrowth of eyelashes. One can also use oral tofacitinib, but that's more toxic and it has to be used carefully. But many dermatologists have availability from compounding pharmacists to use the topical ointment. There's also a big effort in the field of dermatology to use platelet-rich plasma. There have now been 5 double-blind, placebo-controlled trials for scarring alopecia with positive results in 4 of them. So there are some developments. What's new with immune suppressives? Immune suppressives are areas that not only kill bad cells, but unfortunately they also kill some good cells. They are not specific. They include methotrexate, mycophenolate or CellCept. They include azathioprine or Imuran. And they also include a drug called leflunomide or Areva, which has been on the market since the early 90s for rheumatoid arthritis. There are 2 or 3 lupus trials that suggest it has some modest benefits for lupus arthritis, but what's new is that in 2010, it got approved by the Chinese version of the FDA for lupus in the kidney, but in a dose much higher than we use in the United States, which is 10 to 20, in a dose of 40 milligrams a day. Is there anything new with corticosteroids? Well, there's 3 things that are new. One is the release of a drug called Rayos, which stands for timed-release prednisone, and that's based on the assumption that interleukin-6 is responsible for much of the damage in systemic lupus or in rheumatoid arthritis and polymyalgia rheumatica. Most interleukin-6 is released between 2 and 6 a.m. So in order to target this, one takes a tablet at 10 p.m., and then when it starts to work at 2 a.m., because it has to leach through a double matrix, most of the drug is released between 2 and 6 a.m. There is a lupus clinical trial network called LUCIN, which is currently underwriting, as part of its repurposing effort, a trial with Rayos for lupus, with its primary outcome being improvement in fatigue. All 60 patients have been enrolled in this study, and it's a 3-month trial, and hopefully we'll have some results by the end of this year. The second agent is there is a drug called Acthar, which a precursor of corticosteroid is ACTH in the adrenal gland, which stimulates the release of corticosteroids. It works similarly to corticosteroids, but it also has a unique mechanism of action in dealing with the melanocorticoid system, melanin. And whether this is important in lupus is not certain, but nevertheless, there is an ongoing clinical trial to see if this very expensive agent is worthwhile. And finally, several of our pharmaceutical colleagues are working on trying to figure out why some patients, 1 milligrams of prednisone has the same effect as 5 milligrams. And everybody seems to have different receptors and metabolism of steroids. So there are certain selective glucocorticosteroid agents that are being looked at in phase 2 trials. What's new with calcineurins? What is a calcineurin? Calcineurins are agents that have historically been used to treat lupus in the kidney, and they prevent patients with organ transplant from rejecting them. It includes cyclosporin, tacrolimus, or Prograf, and rapamycin. And these drugs, tacrolimus in particular, is now being used more and more for lupus nephritis. There are studies suggesting that that compared to cyclophosphamide or mycophenolate, at least for the first 6 months, but not longer, it may be equal. And now there's some efforts to add it on to azathioprine or mycophenolate. What's interesting about this family of drugs is it appears to be safe in pregnancy. There was a study published last year suggesting combining it with corticosteroids and Cellcept from Hong Kong and in China, suggesting that combinations of tacrolimus with mycophenolate or cyclophosphamide is synergistic. So there are some incremental improvements. It's hard to believe, but belimumab was approved in 2011. It's now 8 years later. And we now know from long-term follow-up of the original studies that this drug has legs, and people are still taking it 8, 9, 10 years later, which is much better adherence than almost anything, including animalarials. And some interesting work that was published last year suggests that the drug is indeed steroid sparing by at least 20%, and that 1 lupus patient in 7 during this period was able to totally discontinue corticosteroids. And now we know from following patients up to now 13 years that if we look at certain accepted markers of lupus damage, that it does prevent progression of the disease compared to those who did receive standard of care but not belimumab. And about 1.5 years ago was heralding the introduction of subcutaneous belimumab, where one could more easily give it as a shot once a week. I think the number of people taking belimumab in the last 18 months has trebled in the United States. This agent is equivalent to the intravenous form. Some people like the intravenous, some people like the subcutaneous, but this is certainly simple, very, very safe, and effective. We talk about the concept of repurposing. Repurposing means taking a drug that's already on the market and trying for a disease that it's not approved for, and some are listed here. We know that rituximab, which is approved for rheumatoid arthritis and approved for many other hematologic disorders, as well as pemphigoid in the last year, has failed in several poorly designed trials to reach its primary outcome measures. But now we know, following patients for 5-10 years, that certain lupus subsets, such as those with inflammatory arthritis, central nervous system disease, polyinflammation of many nerves, vasculitis, and low counts, do appear to benefit from rituximab. Abatacept or Orencia is another rheumatoid arthritis drug that has not achieved its primary outcome in several lupus trials of various quality design, but it does appear in just about most of these trials if one has an inflammatory arthritis to improve it. Also, there are drugs on the market for rheumatoid arthritis as well as vasculitis that block a cytokine known as interleukin-6. And some of these are known as Actemra or Kevzara. There are a few publications of agents using anti-IL-6 drugs in lupus, one from the NIH that appears to improve joint and skin disease, although in a couple of the trials it has not met its primary outcome. It has, with certain lupus phenotypes, met secondary outcomes, appears to be generally very well tolerated, and for our patients with lupus who maybe have a rheumatoid overlap or rheumatoid factor, it's sometimes used or used in other specific circumstances. We all have seen a lot of advertisements on television for anti-tumor necrosis factors, for rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, and other conditions, inflammatory bowel disease with etanercept or Enbrel, infliximab or Remicade, adalimumab or Humira. And there are some evidence that it does improve lupus arthritis, but the studies that have been published show that it's short-lived and relatively disappointing. And finally, we have the new small oral agents that are on the market, which is baricitinib and Xeljanz. And these are approved for rheumatoid arthritis, and Xeljanz I also mentioned as tofacitinib as a topical, but there is a study going on at the NIH for tofacitinib in lupus, and there also, you heard earlier today, a presentation of a phase 2 trial of baricitinib for lupus that is very promising and now going into a phase 3 trial. So why is these treatments not good enough? Well, despite improving survival rates, lupus has a higher than expected mortality rate that has not significantly changed since 1980. With the development of steroids, dialysis, improved antibiotics, improved antihypertensive agents, and we still, in the 1960s, had cyclophosphamide, methotrexate, azathioprine, hydroxychloroquine, and prednisone. So we have not made a huge difference. The risk of myocardial infarction is 50 times greater in women in their last 10 years of their reproductive years. Accelerated atherogenesis, heart attacks, is attacking younger women. And there was a study published a few months ago that the second most common cause of women in their 20s dying in the United States is lupus. Lupus is associated with more emergency room visits and hospitalizations. When a lupus patient goes to the emergency room for chest pain, it could be their lungs, it could be pleurisy, it could be an effusion, it could be an infection, it could be a pulmonary embolus, it could be pulmonary hypertension, it could be the chest wall or costochondritis, it could be pericarditis, it could be microvascular angina, and it could be a heart attack or arteritis of the coronary arteries. And most people in emergency rooms just send these people out with opiates, and it really doesn't get to the underlying problem. And up to a third of all lupus patients are disabled within 5 years, and more than half at 10 years. Work loss is a common consequence of lupus. It decreases stamina and endurance, and a lot of the reasons are for musculoskeletal, neuropsychiatric, or thrombotic complications. This leads to loss of socialization skills, personal isolation, loss of self-esteem, and it's a huge, huge problem. And even if the SED rate and CRP and the DNA and complement aren't that bad, or they show mild disease, studies have shown that damage still accrues. In other words, 40% of lupus patients have an increase in their damage index to tissue after 3 years of follow-up. And a third of patients accrue organ damage within 5 years. And, as I mentioned, even with very low smoldering activity. So we have our work cut out for us. The progression to end-stage renal disease or needing dialysis has not decreased since 1980. And even though certain ethnic and racial groups and certain those with literacy and educational attainment do better than others, in each group, the progression to end-stage renal disease has not decreased over time. So, despite new advances and improvements in our understanding of lupus therapies, existing regimens are still associated with poor quality of life, shortened lifespans, and suboptimal treatment. So new treatments are needed, and the next step is to bring on Joan Merrill, who is going to charm us and dazzle us with where things are starting to go from here. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Yes, there's really a lot of good news, and I'm going to try and cover some of that for you. But it's complicated good news, so you're going to have to bear with me as we try to get through what we can and we cannot conclude from some of the things that we're seeing now. By the way, the title of my talk was Clinical Trials for Lupus, Who Me? The reason I titled it that way is because I'm leading into a discussion, and I hope you will engage in it with us this afternoon, about what it takes to actually want to participate in a clinical trial. And just so you know that I'm not some person at a podium who doesn't know anything about being a scared patient, I had cancer about 12 years ago. And I was literally sitting on an exam table with half my clothes off, and somebody shoved a big legal-looking document under my nose and said, "Sign here." And I looked at it, and it was a consent form for a clinical trial. I'm a clinical trialist. I knew that was wrong. So I said, just a minute. I got to read this thing first. Well, eventually I read it, and I signed up for the clinical trial, and then I said, bring me your principal investigator because I'm going to scream at him. What is he doing to his patients? Not everyone would have known what that piece of paper was. So I know it happens. And the key thing here is, yeah, we need more trust in each other, but we also need to be able to earn each other's trust. So we're on a rampage now. We want to get everybody involved, and we want to make it happen so that we can get more people into clinical trials. And one of the important pieces of this that's going to thread through this talk is that minority patients who already are having poorer outcomes in lupus, as Dan alluded to, are underrepresented in clinical trials. And that's going to make health disparities worse. Now, you don't get people into clinical trials by shoving papers under their nose and saying, sign here. You need to engage in a conversation. And clinical trials aren't right for everybody. And not everybody can even get in the clinical trial. They have lots of rules. But we got to find enough representation by everyone so that we can get better drugs that will work for everyone, and it will help us address the disparities in how treatments are working for different people. It'll be part of the problem. Now, you see here I put up a cartoon. This is a cartoon of the immune system. What you see is a whole bunch of Pac-Man-looking objects. Those are the cells of the immune system, and they all have little labels. M is for monocyte, D is for dendritic cell, T is for T cell, B is for B cell. And they all interact. And when they interact, they do it in different ways. Sometimes they literally reach out and shake hands. They each have little receptors that recognize each other, and they shake hands. Sometimes they shake hands loosely. Sometimes they shake hands violently. And depending on what happens in those interactions, different signals are sent into and out of these cells. They're signaling each other, almost like they're talking on the telephone. Sometimes they just let little proteins out into the bloodstream, and the proteins swim around and find the other cell and get up on their surface and signal in. And all of these signals are telling the immune system how to operate like a little army. The problem is we have to let things into our bodies. You ever heard of food? So we have to know how to recognize what's food, what's friend, what's enemy. So what happens in lupus? What causes lupus? Well, every little one of those proteins, and now we're talking about literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of different proteins, come into your body because you inherit them from your mom and your dad. And it is normal in the human population for those little proteins to be a little different in some subset of the population. So there are literally millions of ways in which you can be different from your sister, your brother, your cousin, or someone unrelated to you in just the fine-tuning of how those proteins are made. And those proteins are the ones shaking hands, talking on the phone, communicating, and sometimes it's a little less, sometimes it's a little more. You can imagine that we all have very unique immune systems. Well, if you have lupus, you have a disorder of your immune system. You have a very complicated illness. It should not be surprising to you that one person's lupus is not identical to another person's lupus, because it's different little proteins working in different ways and different combinations that lead to this final common pathway where we get these things we recognize as lupus: ANA, anti-DNA, arthritis, rash, kidney involvement, and all those other things. Those are way down the road from a lot of different stuff that happened up here. So how are we going to get new drugs for lupus? We are going to have to figure each person out individually and put them into the kind of a grouping of who would be good for drug A, who would be good for drug B, who would be good for drug C. And maybe there's somebody who needs drug A and C. Now, do you know how we do that right now? We guess. Did you know we have the technology to stop guessing and start doing it right? We do. Anybody who knows me knows what's missing. What's missing? Money. If we had the money, we have the technology already. We could do this thing. Here's the good news. Want to know the good news? See all those companies? They're all developing drugs for lupus right now. They're all in clinical trials for lupus, every one of them. And there's more coming. I was talking to some companies today. New drugs are coming. And these drugs are very sophisticated. They target one little protein here, one little protein there, one way in which there's an interaction between two proteins. And these companies are very aware about what needs to be done. And it's complicated and it won't come fast, but they're making the investment into trying to subset the patients with lupus into who ought to even try the drug. After you try the drug, how do we figure out how best to dose it for you, right? And what other drugs should be used with it and not used with it? And it's horribly complicated. We have the technology, and all those companies are trying to make it happen, and they're investing that wonderful thing that we need, money. And it's happening. I don't mean to stand up here and say the world is perfect and your Savior is at hand, because that's not how it works, as you well know. We tried that 2 years ago. That didn't work out so well. But I will say this. There's stuff happening, and it's true, and it's real, and you can have a whole lot of hope from that. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, this was 10 years ago, and we ought to really redo it, because I'd love to know if it's changed, but talking to people I know, I doubt it. Patients are not really satisfied with the treatment that they're getting today for lupus, and so this is a little survey that was done by the LFA and Lupus Europe working together, which we need to do more of, and we need to do this survey again for sure. But basically, if you go to the third from the end, about 82% of patients say that the treatment that they're taking affects their activities of daily life. In other words, the side effects are causing trouble just like the disease is. And 51.2% of patients with lupus were on steroids at that time. Since Dan broke the ice and people seem to be willing to raise your hands, how many people here have lupus or willing to say so? And now put your hand down if you are no, keep it up. Put your hand down if you are not on steroids. 51 looks good. Okay. Now, when you're developing treatments for lupus, we have to think about several things. And this is what a person who wants to think about being in a clinical trial needs to think about also. If you go in a clinical trial, you're going to have some risks. Of course, if you just sit there on the table and take whatever medicine your doctor prescribes, which very little is known about and hasn't gone through a whole testing process, you got some risks too. So we're going to weigh our risks. My doctor's experienced. My doctor knows a lot about these drugs. Here's a clinical trial. I'm going to read this long consent form and try to figure out what they know about it and what my risks might be. But there are two risks. One is the risk that you'll flare, and the other is the risk that this drug will cause you side effects. It's really true no matter when you start a new drug, but it's a really particular risk to think about when you're thinking, do I want to sign a consent form to be in a clinical trial? Of course, everybody knows if you sign a consent form to be in a clinical trial, you're now in jail and you can't get out, right? You have to do the trial, right? Is that right? No, good. It's not right. You can leave the next minute. Okay. Sorry. So how are we going to get to where we need to get? And what are we going to get out of these clinical trials? In the far future, this is going to be solved very early on in the course of what we're doing with genetics. We have the technology to figure out right now, looking at someone's genes, whether that person would be a good candidate for a certain drug. Now, there are two ways to look at genes. One way to look at genes is to look at how the gene is constructed. That's what you're inheriting from your mom or your dad. What is that blueprint actually instructing the body to do to make proteins? A gene is just a blueprint for your proteins. So what's it got in it? What does it say there? Can we read it? That's one kind of genetics. Another kind of genetics is how much of that gene is coming out of the cell to make proteins. And we have all kinds of things going on in our body to say, don't make so much of that protein. Oh, make more of that protein. And all those signals going in and out of the cells I was talking about are actually having an impact on that. So we call that gene expression. Now, what you're probably not going to be surprised about is that lupus is more similar between patients if you just look at the symptoms. It's not very similar at all if you look at the genetics in terms of which genes did you inherit. But in between there is called gene expression, and what it turns out is that it's in between similar. It's a little more similar than genetics is to look at gene expression. And so gene expression is probably where we're going to go to try to pick a drug for our patients in the future. You're patient X because your gene expression can change over time. If you're on a background treatment of 10 milligrams of prednisone and 400 milligrams of Plaquenil or hydroxychloroquine, your gene expression may be different than it was when you weren't taking them. So if I'm going to add on a new drug, I can't select it based on what you were born with. I got to select it based on where you are now when you're on these different drugs. I hope that makes sense to everybody. So genetics is going to change treatment strategies because we're going to know what we're doing a whole lot better than we do by going, well, I have a lot of experience with, Imuran or azathioprine. I have a lot of experience with it. It works for about 40% of my patients, so I'm going to try it on you. Great. I have a 40% chance. Okay. But can't you do a fancy blood test like they have in the movies and tell me what drug really is right for me right now? Yes, we can, but we need money. Okay. But here's something that's already been done. It's not really great news, but it just shows you the level at which we can do things. Cyclophosphamide is a very strong, toxic medicine that is used for severe lupus. We've used it for many, many years, going back a long way. We understand it a lot. It can be used safely. It's often used still for kidney disease around the world. It turns out, forget all the stuff in the white letters because, it's kind of deep and dense. Let's just go to the yellow letters and the orange letters. See the orange letters down there that say CYP2C19*2? That is defining a certain kind of gene that people inherit that has a little bit of a difference from the same kind of gene that other people inherit. So it's called a variant. In the population, certain percent of people inherit this particular thing. And if you inherit it and you take cyclophosphamide, we know that you have less risk of the major side effect that scares lupus patients, which is ovarian failure, which means you can't get pregnant. Okay? You have less risk if you have this gene, and we know that, and we could test you for that. We could test you for that tomorrow. But on the other hand, it turns out, they found out, that it doesn't work as well in those patients either. So if you were depending on cyclophosphamide to save your kidneys, and you found out it was a little safer in terms of whether you could get pregnant later, the bad news is it doesn't work as well for those patients as for other patients. But at least we know that now. And that's the level at which we have the technology. Here it is, folks. That's the level at which we have the technology today to do this for all of our patients and all of the drugs. And I think if there were no more wars, we'd have the money too. Now, what about people from different races? People from different races do not have the same results as people from other races. So let's talk about lupus and people who are of African descent. We know that lupus is more common in people of African descent than other races. People of African descent are often younger at diagnosis. People of African descent have more severe skin disease called discoid lupus, and they are more likely to get kidney involvement. If you do a cross-sectional study of your lupus patients and you give scores for how much flare there is going on, people of African descent have higher scores, more flares. And there's also higher numbers of certain kinds of antibodies that are associated with lupus, and there they are, anti-SM, RNP, and COO. Okay? Those are signs that lupus is more severe generally in that population of people. How many people here think that means that's going to be true for everyone of African descent? Do not raise your hands. Good. Because when you do these studies, you're going, oh, you're more likely, you're more this, you're more that. If I were a person of African descent, I would be hopping mad, and I'd say, how about me? What is it for me? What's my risk? And we have the technology to do that too. Nevertheless, we do think about race a little bit when we take care of our patients because we don't have access to all of these tests right now. And so, for example, we know that there was a trial of Cellcept or mycophenolate, MMF, Cellcept, okay, in people with kidney involvement. And if you looked at all of the patients, cyclophosphamide, that real toxic one that only a few people seem to be spared the risk for losing their ability to get pregnant, and also it doesn't work as well for them, we know all that. It worked about the same as MMF in kidney disease, overall in the population. That's over on the left of this slide. But if you looked at what it says other, I don't know what other means, but it was primarily people of African descent. They were not Caucasian, they were not Asian. Primarily people of African descent. It looked like, in the orange, MMF was making more people better than cyclophosphamide in the blue. Now that's something to know. But remember, if 60% of people responded to MMF, that means 40% didn't. So you can't go, MMF works for people of African descent. You can only say it's more likely to work. Except it's not really more likely to work for any given individual. We need to get down to the individual level, clearly. And remember, we have the technology, and remember, we don't have the money. Okay? Just remember those two things. We have the technology, we don't have the money. And again, it doesn't mean cyclophosphamide doesn't work in people of African descent. It doesn't mean that. It worked for 38.5%. That's a lot of people. It works for a lot of people. I'm just pointing this out to you. And yet, you're a doctor, you're in your clinic, you've got your patient in front of you, you show them this information, they're all going to pick MMF, aren't they? And I would too. But I hope they're all going to then say, can you do better than that next time? Can you find me better data than this? I hope so. But we do know that at the genetic level where I'm trying to take you, there are differences between people of African descent and people of Caucasian descent. So you can see this list of genes here. And there's been association between the ones on top in lupus in people of Caucasian descent and not in people of African descent. And the ones on the bottom have been associated with lupus in the people of African descent, but not of Caucasian descent. What does that mean? Does that mean that if I'm of African descent, I can't have any of those Caucasian risk genes? People think that. It's not true. Because association is the same thing we were just looking at with the drugs. Association just means it reached statistical significance. It had that much impact in a population. We are not a population. We are individuals. And there are people of African descent who have the same gene variants as the Caucasian people, and there are people of Caucasian descent who have some of the same variants as the people of African descent. Just so you understand, we really are an admixture now. We need to get away from race. We need to get to individuals. It's got to happen, or we will not make the kind of breakthroughs for lupus that we need. However, we're not going to get there unless we get more people of all races, especially African descent, into clinical trials, so that these very sophisticated measurements can be done. And these drugs that are very promising can be properly tested. But this is just showing you that in many of the large phase 3 trials that have been done so far, the percentage of people of African descent is very low. Okay? And that means that a large segment of our population who we know may have a propensity to have some patients with severe lupus are not having drugs developed for them. And that's got to change. But that means we need volunteers, but we need empowered, knowledgeable volunteers, not people who would say yes and not scream. I screamed, I did the right thing. You need to scream if someone shoves a consent form under your nose, right? And says, sign here, right? Don't do that. So we're working on a project. It's been funded by the Office of Minority Health, Health and Human Services. So the government is actually funding this, what's left of it. And it's called Improving Recruitment of Minority Patients to Lupus Trials Through Continuing Education and Provider Support. We're working with primary care doctors and patients. And what we want to have is a two-way education program. We can educate about lupus and how it works and what's going on, but we need the patients to educate us about what they need, what it takes, how can we help, empower, and get them involved and give them the chance to participate in drug development. We need to work as a team and as a community, and that includes the primary care doctors who often are not even referring those patients into the study centers. So it's going on, and I'm going to show you a little data from a poster we have at this meeting. This is Dr. Christina Arians right here. She's running it. Very preliminary, but we asked some questions of some primary care doctors and some lupus patients. And you can see that there were 55 doctors and 32 lupus patients. Say a little bit about them. And we're looking for people of African descent. So we got 46.7%, which is better than many studies do. But we want more people. We're looking for you. We want you to participate and help us with this. And we asked a couple of very controversial questions. You know, when I grew up, I actually went in elementary school to a segregated school in Herndon, Virginia. And I thought things had changed until about 2 years ago. And now I'm not so sure. So we're asking some pretty pointed questions to people because we're trying to figure out what's causing health disparities and why it isn't going away. So the first question we asked was kind of moving in. Does low income impact a person's ability to follow a clinical trial protocol? If you don't have much money, are you less likely to be able to come to clinic and comply with a protocol and understand what's going on and do your part? We asked primary care providers and we asked lupus patients. You can see on the left are the no's and on the right are the yeses. And then it's gradations in between. So strongly disagree is over on the left, and then maybe you disagree, and then I'm neutral, and then maybe I agree, and okay. As you can see here, lupus patients pretty much strongly disagree. They don't think that a low income would stop them from being educated. Hello, it's the 21st century. You know, we've got the internet. We've got I don't know what low. I don't even know. I don't think it takes much income to be aware of what's going on around you. And so I agree with the patients. But look at the primary care providers. They weren't really sure what they thought. A lot of them kind of agreed. If you're a low income, you couldn't be in a clinical trial. Does that mean that if a person has low income, they're not going to refer them to the study center where they can get what they need? I don't know. Okay, so that's one thing. If a doctor and patient are from two different races or backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, does it affect discussions about trials? Lupus patients were kind of neutral. They were kind of in the middle. More disagreed than agreed, but a whole lot of them were in the middle. Look at the doctors. They just weren't sure, but they kind of thought maybe no, okay? They were a little bit more towards no. If I'm a different race, it's fine, it's not a problem. But if the patient is more worried about it than you are, you're not communicating. So that's something we need to think about. And then you can't see the question here because I goofed and I didn't put it on. But this had to do with education. Can a person with high school education, is that going to impact their ability to be in a clinical trial? Lupus patients said no. You don't need a high school education to be in a clinical trial. And you know what? They're right. Informed consents are written on a 6th grade level for that reason. But I don't know if you've noticed this. Some people can talk in a very mature, grown-up, straight from the heart way, and they don't have to use ridiculous, long words that nobody knows what they mean. So that's how they're supposed to be written. There's work to be done on that, and I'll get to that in 1 second as I wrap up. But just keep in mind that the lupus patients are willing to say, no, you don't need a high school education to be in a trial. And you know what? The doctors pretty much agreed with them. No, they said mostly no. And yet just maybe a few more of them, or maybe a few less of them actually, were neutral. So maybe the lupus patients were just slightly less, sure than the doctors. So that's good. We have a website, and we want you all to come to it. There it is, https://empower.chrysalis.llc.com. Please come to it. It's a way to, we're going to keep working on it, and we're going to put this on it. We're going to put this whole set of talks on it. But we're also going to have two-way interaction on it. And there are two current projects I want to call your attention to that I hope will get some of you involved. One is we need to get input from real people about how we write these informed consents. Right now, they look like huge, they look like you just bought a mansion, in Beverly Hills. It's huge, long documents with all kinds of legal language in them. Even though it's written on a 6th grade level, it keeps leaking into all kinds of other words and it repeats itself, and it goes around in circles. And my favorite is every clinical trial now has to have something that says, if you go in this trial, you could die. Well, hello, if I get in my car, I could die. So what does that mean? Just show me the data. Show me how many people have taken this drugs and how many people died. I'll work it out for myself, If you go in this trial, you could die. We need to get this back on some kind of rational, straightforward, clear, simple level, and it's got to come from the patient. So we want you to tell us we want you to learn about the elements of informed consent, what the legal requirements are in an informed consent, understand why they're there, and help us write better consent forms. And we'll publish them. We'll get them published in medical journals, and we'll start a movement about that. So I hope you'll come to the website, and as we get that project going, you'll get involved in that. And then finally, we just want to hear from you about the actual barriers there are to trial participation. This is not restricted to people of African descent or other patients that are termed minority in the United States and maybe in the majority in many other countries. It's not restricted to you, but you are the people we are most looking for, but we really want everyone to come. So everyone come and help us with this. And that is the end of this talk. We're going to have Susan Burris come up, and she's actually a very exciting speaker. She works for GSK, and she's actually in charge of a whole program to find and give patients a voice in the development process. And this is a company, that has developed the first approved new biologic for lupus, belimumab. So I'm going to welcome Susan to the stage.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Dr. Wallace and Dr. Merrill for inviting me to speak today about the challenges that we have in recruiting in clinical trials. And there are many, but today I'm going to cover some of the most common ones. But since they asked some questions, I'd like to start by asking some questions. How many of you, and you don't have to be a lupus patient in the audience, how many of you have been asked by your doctor to participate in a trial, or maybe your children have been asked to participate in a trial? Raise your hand. Okay, not that many. How many of you who have been asked have actually participated? Okay. And how many of you, if you were asked, would consider participating in a trial? A lot more hands. And I'm sure there's some of you that would not consider participating in a trial. And I appreciate your honesty. I want to just tell you myself that I pushed my mother into a clinical trial for preventative breast cancer, and I have actually entered my children into 2 different trials. So I'm a strong believer in clinical research before I ever entered research when I was practicing as a nurse. So I'd like to move on with my acknowledgments. As Joan pointed out, I am a full-time employee of GSK, and I also want to start by thanking those of you who have had the courage to participate in a clinical trial. It can be overwhelming when that consent might say you can die, to actually sign on that line and say that you're willing to participate. And more than that, I want to thank all of the researchers globally around the world and their site staff for what they do for patients in our communities with respect to research. So Dr. Merrill asked me to present a little bit about research basics. And I do apologize to those of you who are very savvy in research, because you're going to understand the elements that I talk about. And so this will be a little bit of a primer for those of you who have never heard a lot about research, or just a refresher for those of you who are fully aware of the basic practices of research. So research basics. Countries have very strict regulations. And as you know, there's international regulations. The FDA has good clinical practices, that do get modified occasionally, and as researchers, we have to be aware of those modifications. There's international standards, which we need to apply in all of our studies. And these are there to protect patients, but they're also there for another reason, which throughout my talk you're going to hear a little bit about. It's to ensure the quality of the data. Because if we break the rules when we're running studies, then we are not able to understand what our studies are telling us. So it's very important to make sure that we follow the regulations. And anyone who participates in doing research needs to know these regulations, including academic institutions, sponsor companies, as well as the NIH. We all follow similar regulations. And sometimes countries will have even more specific regulations where if we're doing research in that country, we have to be aware of those regulations. So clinical research, it's obvious that we do it to determine if a drug is safe and how well it works in the population that we're studying. So we answer several questions. We answer, does the drug work? Well, it may work, but if it doesn't work any better than something that's already been in the market, it's probably not of value to continue researching, because we look to bring new benefits to the health and the quality of life of patients. We also want to make sure that the side effects of the drug are not worse than the disease itself, and that the side effects are tolerable and that they don't dramatically decrease the quality of life for the patients that we're trying to improve their health. So Joan talked about money, and I can't talk about research without talking a little bit about the timelines and the cost of doing research. For one drug to come to the market, and these are estimates depending on your different sources, it can take about 10 years and $2.6 billion, not million, billion. And it's estimated that only 1 in 5 of those drugs that actually make it into human testing will ever be approved and be available to the patients who need them. And actually, if you dig deeper, 1 in 5,000 molecules that are studied in the laboratory will make it into human testing and to the market. So we have a very high failure rate, which is unfortunate. And I think it speaks to a lot of what Joan is talking about. If we can more precisely target the patient population that we want to study, maybe we can do a better job and have less failures. I want to say, though, when you say a drug has failed, if we have done a study with high-quality data, even though the data may say that the drug does not work in that population that we were studying, we have not wasted research. Research of any kind is very valuable, and scientists can learn more about the disease targets, or maybe sometimes it's just tweaking the dose of the disease and the dose of the drug and trying again and possibly getting the right answers. So no research that's done with high quality is ever wasted. And at GSK, as do most other companies and research centers, we make sure that we publish both the positive and negative studies. I just wanted to show a brief cartoon here about the phases of research. Most of you are aware that the molecule comes out of the lab, then it goes into phase 1. Other than in oncology trials, most of the time phase 1s are done in healthy volunteers, people who are volunteering to take a drug to make sure that it's safe. For the first time in human studies, those are called. Then we move on to what are called phase 2 studies, where we actually test the drug in patients with the disease, as well as maybe looking to see what dose might be the best. Then we go into the larger phase 3 trials, which you hear a lot about. And sometimes those trials can be very large, in the tens of thousands. Sometimes they can be, like in the belimumab studies, in the 800 to 1,000 patient range. And then once you get approval, you also have to then continue to do testing for those long-term safety data that's so important for us, testing in other populations, maybe in pediatric studies to find out how the drug works in children, or in populations that were not well studied or well characterized in the primary phase 3 trials. So Joan has spoken a lot about informed consent, so I'm not going to go into that in as much detail as I had planned, but one of the things that I can't stress enough, and which she stressed in a nice dramatic fashion for us, is it is a process. While informed consent is a document, it really is a process, or I will call it even more so a conversation. It is the document that explains the trial to the patient and tells them what the purpose of the trial is, what the commitment is to the trials, the number of times you may have to come to the clinic, how much blood will be taken from you or other tests that will be done, the variety of where the data, who owns the data when it's done, will I be able to find out the results of the study, where it will be stored, what are my rights as a patient participant in a trial, and what happens if something happens to me in a trial, as well as what is expected of you as a patient. So it's an incredibly important process, and informed consents are to be written that 6th, 7th, 8th grade level, depending. You can find different resources on that. However, I like Joan's way of saying, we drift off into words that maybe are not something that a 6th grader can use. They're legal documents, so of course you can understand that they have a lot of information in them that may not be familiar. And on top of that, they're primarily written in the English language, and things do not always translate well. So if you have a trial where you are trying to recruit different populations, you need to make sure that that translation is accurate and understandable in different languages around the world. They can feel very technical, and they can feel very overwhelming because they are not thin documents at this point. And it's critically important. You have an obligation, if you're considering a trial, to review the consent. If somebody says you don't have time to take it home and review it with your family or your significant other, then I would say I'm not going to participate. It should allow you the time to go through it in high detail and to come back and ask questions. Once you've had your questions answered and you decide that it is a trial you would like to participate in, signing the informed consent is actually the permission to move forward with the trial. Now, what that means is that your doctor may have done some preliminary review of your records to determine if you might qualify for the study. But at this point, you begin to be tested to actually see if you can be in the trial. And as Joan mentioned, participants can leave at any time. And you don't have to give your physician a reason why you're leaving the trial. You could have moved further away, you don't feel well, you want to go back to some other medication, although we do like you to fully understand what you're consenting for when you start a trial, so that information that comes along that might have been known in the beginning isn't a surprise and a reason for leaving the trial. So understanding entry requirements. Every study, no matter how big or how small, has what we call in the industry inclusion and exclusion criteria. These are the criteria that are important to limit as many variables as possible between participants to ensure that we have the right patients so that we can understand how the drug is working. And some of the variables might be, how long have you had the illness? Maybe we want to study people who have just been diagnosed with lupus. So the entry criteria might be that you've only been diagnosed within the last 3 to 5 years. Or maybe we want to study people who have had the disease for a long period of time or have significant organ involvement. So the duration of illness, the severity of the disease, medications that you might be taking. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to be very careful, especially in the early phase of the drug, to make sure that as we learn more about it, it's not interacting with our new drugs. So we may limit what other medications you can take. Medical history is very important. We don't often do trials where people have significant other types of illnesses ongoing at the same time, because then you can have a lack of clarity as to whether the other illness is causing problems or the introduction of this new therapy. And also family planning. It's very important if especially a lot of our lupus patients are young women, and when you have to think about this trial is going to last for 3 years potentially, am I willing to postpone having a family for that period of time? Because often when you're on a new therapy that we don't know a lot about, we may ask that you use contraception. This can be true for men in research as well, that maybe their wives are planning on getting pregnant. So all of these things are part of the conversation that you need to have with your physician when you're considering a trial. And oftentimes, unfortunately, patients will go through the terrible decision on whether to enroll in a trial or not, a tough decision, I shouldn't say terrible, tough decision, and they'll go through all this blood work and all this testing and hours in the clinic only to be told that they can't participate. And if you're severely ill, or if you were looking forward to trying this new treatment, your doctor thought that the trial might be something of benefit to you, it can be exceedingly disappointing. And we have to recognize that. And that process is called a screen failure. But as I mentioned in the beginning, we have to follow the rules, because if we don't follow the rules, then we don't have quality data at the end, and we don't know the patients. They are not, we haven't controlled for those variables I mentioned. So we definitely have challenges with recruitment in clinical trials. Joan showed you some of the statistics. I'm going to show you a few more. And we know we have a lot of work to do, and I do believe that things are changing. But one of the biggest hurdles that surprises me, and I've seen this in multiple resources, is if 70% of participants live more than 2 hours travel time from their sites. And that's primarily when you look at diseases where people may be treated in a referral center, because they have to get into that referral center. And obviously, that does have an economic and time burden on people that we need to be aware of. 50% of clinical trials fail to recruit in the time period that they initially proposed. So when we're planning trials, we determine what we think, how many patients we think we can recruit per site per month. But over 50% of the time, we're wrong, and it takes much longer. And what this means is that then the cost of the trials go up because we need to put on more sites, and there's delays. And it also is that delay in bringing new information to the community. 50% of sites that actually say they'll recruit patients only end up recruiting one patient or none. So sites need to obviously work hard. And oops, I went a little too fast there. And in some of our long longitudinal studies, almost 40% of patients will ultimately drop out. And lastly, I wanted to put up there trust. We have a problem with trust, and it's because of human rights violations that were perpetrated by the medical and research community in the United States. And we have to recognize that this lack of trust exists, that it's valid, and that we have to work to find ways to restore the trust in the community. So I want to just mention, and this is primarily for those of you from the U.S., that we have changing demographics, and we need to make sure that the demographics of our trial reflect the demographics of the disease. We have not done a good job. When you look at BLISS 76 and BLISS 52, you saw the ratio of minorities in the trial. And we need to make sure that those that are suffering the most from the disease and can benefit the most from the disease have the opportunity to get the drug. And if you look at the changing demographics of the United States, we are becoming a very, very diverse community within the United States. And the FDA defines this in 5 racial categories: American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or or Pacific Islander, white, and also ethnicity, Hispanic and Latino, non-Hispanic or Latino. And when you file a research study, the FDA expects for you to tell them what was the population that you studied and the percentage with these different racial and ethnic categories. So I know Joan presented some of the data regarding racial and ethnic minorities. Women and elderly are historically underrepresented in trials. And I think this is where we have the area where we can show the most improvement. But it's not just a U.S. problem. Historically, all minority participation in clinical trials is about 17%. And we know in the U.S. that African Americans are underrepresented, and clinical research to recruit African Americans and retain them has been very difficult. Additionally, as mentioned, lupus, the severity of the lupus and the amount of lupus is much higher in this population. So we need to increase diversity in clinical research. And why is it important? And I'm just once again reiterating what Dr. Merrill said, that we need to make sure we design drugs that treat the patients that will benefit from them the most. We need to make sure that they're safe in every population, or if they're not safe in a specific population, we need to understand why there's a difference. People respond differently for all the reasons that were just nicely presented. Disease impact varies from one patient group to another. And we can develop better designer drugs with innovation in precision medicine. And we're not quite there yet, but the science is definitely moving quickly in that direction. And regulators around the world are recognizing the importance of this, and they are not requiring it, but they're asking us to do better. In 2016, the FDA put out expectations and recommendations for a standardized approach, and that's where I showed you the different racial categories which they want us to file our studies with and tell them what were the demographics of the study. And I think that one of the new innovative things on the FDA website, which is very informative, is and it's open to the public, to go look at drug trial snapshots. It's a summary report, and every year they put out any new drug that was approved that year and what were the racial demographics of the population that was recruited. So it's very interesting to go and to look and to see the different types of drugs and actually who's recruiting and who's doing a good job and with the approvals and making sure that there's a diversified population. So in summary, research is highly regulated. Sponsors and investigators must be compliant with all the rules to protect their participants and to deliver that high-quality data that's required. There are large disparities that we recognize now in the percent of participants by age, by sex, by ethnic group, by race in clinical studies globally. For participants in trials, it can be overwhelming. There's unfamiliar language in the consent or even in the office interactions. There's a significant time commitment. There's also, it doesn't always appear to be fair, where you can be excluded from a trial. There's unknown risks, so it can be a bit scary. And there's a possibility that you'll have limited or no benefit from the trial. I feel very strongly that being a study participant or having a loved one enroll in a study really shows that you have true altruism, self-sacrifice. But it's important, if you're a good participant, that you've asked a lot of questions. So where are opportunities for improvement? There are many. And I will tell you, I've been doing research for almost 18 years now, and I really believe that there's a shift, that we are looking to improve the quality of our research by engaging the experts, and the experts are the patients with the diseases. We have to start by increasing community awareness. I did a talk in September of this past year, and a very wise patient advocate said to me, we need to start early in the schools, educating children about what clinical research is and why it's important, because they'll educate their parents and their grandparents. We need education material that looks like me, but looks like you, and to discuss why research is important, what the value of research is. It's very important for patients to have access to participants who have participated maybe in the same trial or in a different trial to talk about what the trial was like, what were their rights as a participant. We have to improve staff education and training. I'm going to talk a little bit, my last slide is about what sites can do to be better sites and to increase recruitment at their sites. We also need to talk about referrals. 1/3 of all lupus patients have been asked to participate in a trial. 2/3 have never been asked. There was a recent survey done in oncology, for an oncology study, where they went out to people known to have a disease. 16% of those surveyed said they had been asked to participate in a trial. Yet 50% said they would participate had they been asked. Yet 20% of all oncology trials fail because of lack of participation, and they're not able to be complete. So we need to do better. Physicians need to do better about knowing about the research that's going on in the community or even outside of the community, and how to get their patients into those trials if it might be appropriate. We have to build research capability in minority communities so that we can take that burden of travel of 70% away. And I will tell you that while 70% is the average, it's over 3 times farther for a person who lives in a poor community than a person who lives in a wealthy community to get to a research site. So if we want to get rid of some of these health disparities, we have to work on transportation and building community research centers where patients can go within their community, where people are culturally sensitive, they have empathy and understanding for cultural differences. It's important to develop those partnerships within the community, support the local community. Those are all the things that come together to build trust. So for patients, there's a lot going on, I'm pleased to say, in the world of research and working with patients. I know at GSK, we're having patient advisory boards. We are bringing patients in to look at our trials as early as phase 2 to tell us, is this trial feasible? We are trying to work on patient-centered outcomes, not just the outcomes that might be really important to a regulator or to a physician. We can speak to organ damage, but maybe that hair loss is what's keeping you inside your home, or the fatigue. So making sure that we are asking the patients what most about this disease affects you, and what type of outcome, if this drug were truly to be successful, would be best for you. So we are working from the beginning of medicine development now with patients. And then that consent, that pesky consent document, we are having patients come in and review the consent ahead of time and telling us whether this means anything or if it's gibberish to them. And one of the strong pushes that I'm advocating for is that we get patients that represent the population that we're studying to review those consents so that we make sure they're culturally sensitive and culturally appropriate. So these are some of the measures with patients that we're working on, plus just acknowledging participation, making sure that there are thank yous going out, doing surveys throughout the trial to find out how are things going. Sometimes we can't change things that aren't that great in the protocol. Sometimes we can make small changes which actually can make the trial less burdensome to the patient or to the site. And being committed to sharing the results in patient-friendly language. Oftentimes participants finish a trial and then they're never quite sure what the outcome of the study was. So we're committed to making sure that in plain language. I have a picture of the Embrace Consent Guide. We created a very specific guide which answered in plain language a lot of the questions about the consent, because we found that consent was a burden for patients in the Embrace trial. They needed to share with their family and have a better understanding of what they were consenting to. Embrace was a long study, and so we wanted to make sure people knew what the study was about and how long the study would be and what the commitment would be for a patient involved in the study. And lastly, we need to make sure that sites are doing the best that they possibly can to promote research, to talk about research, and to increase the accessibility and improve the patient experience. We know that there's such a thing as unconscious bias, and some of that we saw in the presentation in Joan's questions as far as what do physicians think about education level or race and how they approach a patient with a study opportunity. We need to remove and work on unconscious bias about who do we ask to participate in a trial. We need to make sure that we are designing studies that the patients can follow, but it's also helpful if the site can have office hours that are designated for their research subjects. Possibly you can imagine if you have a job and you cannot take off from work, flexible hours, transportation services. I think about transportation services more than anything else because I'm a nurse and I think about somebody who feels lousy getting up and thinking about having to drive 2 hours to the clinic in the rain at rush hour to be sit at the clinic site for 4 or 5 hours. And I often think that we can do a lot better through direct transportation services. I've just came off of doing some studies with ulcerative colitis. And of course, 2 hours without a bathroom, if you're in the middle of a flare, can be quite difficult. So we need to think of ways, maybe some mobile monitoring that can be done at home, remote, where people can come and draw, if it's just blood, at your home. We need to maximize technology so that the burden on the patient to participate in a trial becomes less and less as we move forward with some of these initiatives. And we need to make sure translation services are there. If you truly are wanting to recruit studies in different populations within your community, you need to make sure that your staff can provide the services that are required to do a trial, which means to be able to have an honest and full and complete conversation with the patient about the requirements. So the vision for the future is that research trials will include the participants that most need the trial drug. The protocols and informed consents will be designed with participant expertise and will be less burdensome, and that patients will understand what they're enrolling in and that their retention will increase. The trials will measure outcomes that are important for both the patient community and the regulatory agencies and the physicians. The community awareness for both patients and local physicians will be so high that everybody will know what research is available and that referrals will go up, and that sites will be supported in their efforts to recruit trial participants, no matter what their age, I should say education, sex, race, or ethnicity, and that pharma will continue to improve and be a better trusted partner. Thank you.
Okay, we're a little over time, but we have a few minutes for questions. Does anybody want to come up? Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I'm wondering, with regard to demographics, how the FDA accounts for biracial or multiracial individuals. Is there room for their participation? I wasn't seeing that.
No one is excluded.
Yeah.
And I'd like Susan to comment on this because as a clinical trial investigator, all I can call people is other. Okay, so Susan, help us.
I'm just going to speak from my experience is that patients don't have to isolate to one demographic category. So, in fact, in the Embrace trial, people could tick several. So.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm from Ghana, and thank you for the presentation. But oftentimes I read that people of African descent have more this, more that. And you talked about we have the knowledge but not the money. And so probably I will reason that is one of the limitations why we don't see the clinical trials in Africa. But also...
Do you know that GSK just did a trial that was only for people of African American descent?
Here in U.S.
It was an international trial, right? And it was presented today. But the reason they had to do that trial is a sad reason. It's because they couldn't get enough people of African descent into the original trials. So belimumab was approved in 2011, and there was this question of whether it would work for people of African American descent, and they were forced because they wished they had been able to do it earlier, to now go back into a whole other trial. So that's part of our problem right now. We need to get more people involved. And on some level, there's this complicated thing because there's a history of abuse of people of African American descent in clinical trials, particularly in the United States. So that's bad. And no wonder it would be kind of hard for a lot of older generation people to even think about being in a clinical trial. Not so true in the younger generation, as we've recently learned. But now is the opportunity there. And so that's really what she's here for at GSK, and that's one of the projects that the government's actually trying to address. It's not easy, but I think things are starting to move.
I think one of your concerns is on the African continent. You're from
Exactly, because
Yeah.
most of it are being done here. And so, yes.
There has never been a
Yes.
clinical trial
where
conducted.
It is not just people of, where it's not just African Americans, but Africans. That's
Right.
what I mean.
Susan.
I didn't understand, sorry.
Yes, I can speak to that a little bit. And part of it is we have difficulty even in some of our poor communities in the United States, people with the appropriate training and the infrastructure and the lab that's required and the pharmacy. And I can speak to with belimumab, it was very complicated because of it being an IV drug. We actually did recruit patients in South Africa, and we looked to start trials in Kenya and Uganda. But due to some of the infrastructure problems that we encountered, plus there's a hard and fast rule that you never do research in a country where you're not sure that you're going to market the drug. And when you have cold chain problems, like the drug has to be stored in certain temperatures and things, there's a whole lot of things that go into making that decision. But we seriously considered many sites in the Caribbean as well as on the continent. Ebola broke out at one of the sites that we were actually looking at. So we ran into a lot of challenge, but we wanted to do that. So I think you'll see more of that.
You know, there is also a history of incredible human rights abuse with large pharmaceutical companies in not that many decades ago in Africa. And so that's a huge hurdle that needs to be addressed and overcome. And the only way to do that for lupus, I think, is empowered patients and physicians and perhaps universities and people with some resources working together to get the right infrastructure, to get the empowered, educated patients involved, and to make it happen. So I think you said you were from a organization, a lupus organization, right, earlier? Yeah. So let's talk.
Thank you very much. Very, very. Yes.
Fabulous. We want you. So one of the things. Oh, this is a family physician who has a daughter with lupus and wants to know, how does she refer patients? You know, part of the problem is getting the information to you. But if you're particularly interested right now in what's going on for lupus, the Lupus Foundation of America website does have a list of trials for lupus. Also, in general, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov and just type in keywords like lupus or lupus rash or, you know, the different, like, that might match a patient and learn about the trials that are going on and eventually, and they'll also often list what sites are doing the trial. And so there are resources out there, but what that really illustrates, where are you from?
Pleasanton.
Pleasanton.
Just
in this area?
About an hour from here.
Okay, but what it really illustrates is that we're not reaching out to you properly.
No, but part of the problem is your daughter is probably under the age of 18, and there's very few pediatric trials.
Well, but she wants to refer her patients. She's a family physician.
But I'm telling you, for your daughter.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
But I have patients as well with lupus,
Okay.
so it'd be nice to know.
LFA and clinicaltrials.gov.
But we need to do better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, my sisters have lupus, so I'm a lupus advocate. And I think her question is basically a valid one. I work with so many providers and physicians, and they do not. And I remember when you guys asked the question, who has been offered to participate in clinical trials? And there were not a lot of hands up. So we do need to let our physicians know that there is a website, because I'm pretty educated and I know about clinicaltrials.gov, but patients don't know about
But
them.
come on, you're a family physician. You're responsible for
I'm not a family
she
physician.
is or they are.
Yes.
They're responsible for every disease known to man. The chances of them stumbling on a resource for lupus just isn't going to be that high, no matter how educated they are. So we're not doing our job right. I'm hearing this.
Yeah, I just think that we need to perhaps create
There's
some
an American
sort.
College of Family Physicians, right? Right?
Sure, there is.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to go there.
Yeah.
We need to do something. We're about lupus, so I'm a little, I'm thinking about lupus, but that's my thing. I need to go to the American College of Family Physicians to say, how do we get this word out?
Yeah.
We need to network better.
Yeah.
Yes.
Correctly.
Thank you.
Network.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay.
Good evening, everybody.
Thank you.